There's a college campus on Staten Island where students walk to class every day, completely unaware of what happened on that same ground decades ago. Where lecture halls now stand, children once lived in conditions so horrific that when a young reporter named Geraldo Rivera finally got inside with a camera in 1972, the footage was almost too disturbing to broadcast. But that's not even the worst part, because while the world was horrified by the neglect, by the filth, by the abuse captured on film, something else had been happening at this place called Willowbrook State School. Something that continued for over 15 years, something that involved deliberate infection of children with a dangerous disease, and it was all approved, documented, and published in America's most prestigious medical journals. This is the story of how hundreds of disabled children became human test subjects, and how almost everyone who could have stopped it chose to look the other way. The year is 1947. New York State opens a gleaming new facility on Staten Island, built on the grounds of a former military hospital. Willowbrook State School, they call it. It's designed to house 4,000 residents, children and adults with intellectual disabilities. Families are told this is progress, a safe place, medical supervision, educational programs, everything a family struggling to care for a disabled child at home could hope for. But there's a problem, and it starts almost immediately. Within just a few years, Willowbrook is already overcrowded. By the early 1960s, over 6,000 people are crammed into a space meant for 4,000. Wards designed for 50 residents now hold 80 or more. The staff is overwhelmed, funding is nowhere near adequate, and the children who arrive at Willowbrook are entering a system that's already breaking apart. These aren't children who can tell their parents what's happening inside. Many are nonverbal, many have severe cognitive impairments. They're invisible to the outside world, hidden away in an institution that's slowly becoming a nightmare. Their families, desperate and out of options, trust that the state of New York will keep them safe. They have no idea what's actually going on inside those walls. Here's where the story takes a darker turn. Inside Willowbrook, hepatitis is everywhere. The disease spreads like wildfire through the overcrowded wards. Contaminated food, contaminated water, close physical contact. Nearly every child admitted to Willowbrook contracts hepatitis within their first year. The staff knows it. The administrators know it. It's just accepted as inevitable. And then a doctor named Saul Krugman arrives. He's a respected virologist from New York University, studying the hepatitis outbreaks. At first, he simply observes the children who naturally get sick, but then Krugman makes a decision that will haunt his legacy forever. He decides that instead of waiting for children to get infected naturally, he'll infect them himself. Let that sink in for a moment. A doctor at a facility meant to care for vulnerable children, deliberately giving them a disease that can cause liver damage, chronic illness, and death. Here's how it worked. Newly admitted children were brought to a special research unit. They were fed extracts containing live hepatitis virus, taken from the feces of already infected patients. Sometimes it was injected directly. Then doctors would watch as the disease took hold. Blood drawn regularly, symptoms recorded. Some children became severely ill. All of them, by design, got sick. This wasn't some secret experiment in a basement. Between 1956 and 1972, hundreds of children went through this program. It was systematic, well documented, published in major medical journals, funded by government agencies, and at every stage, adults in positions of authority knew exactly what was happening. So how did Krugman justify this? How did he convince himself and others that this was acceptable? He had several arguments. First, he claimed that since nearly all Willowbrook children got hepatitis anyway due to the terrible conditions, infecting them in a controlled setting meant they'd actually get better medical care. Second, he argued the research would benefit humanity. Understanding hepatitis could lead to vaccines and treatments. The suffering of a few hundred children was worth knowledge that might save millions. And then there's the consent forms. Parents signed permission forms, so technically everything was legal. But here's the catch. Willowbrook had massive waiting lists. Families desperate for placement were told that if they enrolled their child in the hepatitis study, admission would be fast-tracked. For parents who'd been waiting months or years, who had no other options, this wasn't really a choice at all. Imagine that conversation. You're a parent. Your child has severe disabilities. You can't provide the care they need at home. You've been on a waiting list for months. Then someone in authority tells you there's a way to get your child in right away. All you have to do is sign this form, allowing them to be part of a medical study. The language is complicated. You don't fully understand it, but you're desperate. You trust these people. They're doctors. They work for the state, so you sign. That's not informed consent. That's coercion. And yet, the experiments were approved at every level. The New York State Department of Mental Hygiene knew. The Armed Forces Epidemiological Board provided funding. Ethics review boards gave their blessing. This was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, in the Journal of the American Medical Association. By the standards of the early 1960s, this wasn't considered a scandal. It was considered science. Why? Because this was before modern medical ethics really existed. The Nuremberg Code had been written in 1947 after Nazi medical experiments were exposed, but most American doctors saw that as relevant only to wartime atrocities, not to research in a democracy. The Declaration of Helsinki came in 1964, but enforcement was weak. In practice, researchers had enormous freedom, and vulnerable populations, prisoners, the institutionalized, the poor, were routinely used as test subjects. At Willowbrook, oversight was essentially non-existent. The review board that approved Krugman's work consisted mostly of physicians who saw things the same way he did. State agencies were more worried about managing overcrowding than questioning research protocols, and the parents, scattered across New York with no way to organize, had no voice at all. So year after year, the experiments continued. Krugman's reputation grew. Papers were published, conferences were attended, and in that research unit, children kept getting infected. For over a decade, this happened in plain sight. The research wasn't secret, it just wasn't news. Willowbrook itself wasn't hidden, but institutions like it existed in a social blind spot. People knew they were there. People knew they housed disabled children, but no one really wanted to look closely at what life inside was actually like. That changed in 1972, and the catalyst was a 28-year-old television reporter named Geraldo Rivera. He received a tip from a doctor inside Willowbrook, someone who was horrified by what they were seeing. The doctor helped Rivera and a cameraman sneak onto the grounds with hidden equipment. What they filmed would change everything. Children lying naked on floors covered in filth, rooms filled with human waste, residents huddled together, rocking back and forth in silence, open sores, visible malnutrition. The footage was devastating. When Rivera's report aired on WABC-TV in New York, the public reaction was instant and furious. Politicians who'd ignored Willowbrook for decades suddenly couldn't move fast enough. The place that had been invisible was now impossible to ignore. And in the aftermath, people started asking questions not just about the conditions, but about the research. Medical ethicists who'd been quietly critical of Krugman's work now spoke publicly. They argued that the experiments violated basic human dignity, that consent obtained through coercion wasn't real consent, that no amount of scientific knowledge could justify what had been done to these children. Krugman defended himself for the rest of his life. He insisted the children in his study received excellent care, that his research contributed to hepatitis vaccines, that his intentions were always good, and in a narrow sense, some of that was true. His work did advance scientific understanding, but that didn't erase what he'd done, or who he'd done it to. Here's what might shock you most. No one went to jail. No one was criminally prosecuted. Krugman continued his career, remained respected in many medical circles, and died in 1995 with his reputation largely intact. New York State settled some lawsuits quietly, but there was no trial, no public reckoning, no moment where anyone in authority had to truly answer for what happened. What did change was medical ethics itself. Willowbrook became the case study, the cautionary tale cited in every medical school. It helped drive the creation of stricter protections for human research subjects. In 1974, Congress passed the National Research Act, establishing institutional review boards with real teeth. Informed consent became more than a formality. Vulnerable populations got special protections. Willowbrook finally closed in 1987, 15 years after Rivera's expose. The closure was part of a broader movement away from large institutions toward community-based care. Eventually, the grounds became the College of Staten Island. Where children once suffered, students now study. Most of them have no idea what happened beneath their feet. The survivors of Willowbrook are still out there. Many are alive today. Some live in group homes. Some have community support. A few have shared their stories, though many cannot. The trauma, both from the conditions and from the experiments, left permanent scars, and the families who placed their children there carry their own burden, knowing they trusted an institution that betrayed them so completely. In 2015, a memorial was erected on the college campus. It acknowledges what happened, though it doesn't go into much detail. The hepatitis experiments get barely a mention in most historical accounts. Krugman's name still appears in medical literature, often with no reference to the controversy. Here's what Willowbrook really shows us. This wasn't just one bad doctor or one corrupt institution. This was a systemic failure at every level. Society decided that disabled children's lives mattered less, that the pursuit of scientific knowledge was more important than their dignity, that institutions designed to protect the vulnerable could become places where the vulnerable were exploited, and that was somehow acceptable. The people at Willowbrook, the doctors, the administrators, the review boards, they weren't cartoon villains. They were professionals working within the accepted norms of their time, which raises an uncomfortable question we should all be asking ourselves. What are we accepting as normal right now that future generations will look back on with the same horror? Willowbrook forces us to confront who we give power over the powerless, and what happens when that power is abused. It reminds us that institutions don't protect people just because they claim to, that oversight requires constant vigilance, that consent without real choice is meaningless, and that the most vulnerable people in our society are only as safe as we collectively decide they should be. That college campus on Staten Island looks normal now, clean, modern, safe, but the ground remembers what happened there. And we should too, because the only way to prevent history from repeating itself is to refuse to forget it in the first place. If this story matters to you, if you think these histories need to be told, subscribe to History Explained. We dig into the stories that shaped our world, the ones that make us uncomfortable, the ones we need to remember, because understanding where we've been is the only way to make sure we don't go back.